Have you ever wondered why some of the greatest economies in history, ones that dominated for centuries, eventually crumbled? What if the story of their rise and fall holds the key to understanding the very forces shaping today's global economy? In this series, we're going to look at some of history's most powerful economies, the empires, kingdoms, and nations that rose to greatness, only to face downfall. And with each story, we'll uncover crucial lessons that could help us avoid their mistakes. Ready to learn how the greatest economies fell? Let's dive in. It all begins long before modern economies, with the birth of early civilizations. The first known economy, a barter system, came about in Mesopotamia, where people exchanged goods and services directly. But as cities grew and trade expanded, they needed a more efficient way of handling transactions. Enter the Sumerians. Around 3000 BCE, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia introduced silver as a form of currency. This early form of standardized money helped fuel the growth of trade, agriculture, and urbanization. The Sumerians were the pioneers of an economic revolution, but their economy wasn't invincible. The same expansion that made them powerful led to overuse of resources. Their agricultural system began to suffer, and as their economy became more reliant on conquest and external trade, the empire faced weakening defenses. So, what happened? How did one of the world's earliest civilizations collapse? The lesson here is simple but vital. Sustainability is the foundation of any economy. If you overexploit your resources or fail to adapt to environmental changes, you're setting yourself up for failure. Fast forward a few thousand years to ancient Egypt, one of the longest-lasting civilizations in history. Its economy, fueled by agriculture along the Nile River, was incredibly prosperous. The annual floods of the Nile provided fertile soil, ensuring a consistent agricultural yield. But it wasn't just the Nile that made Egypt's economy strong. It was the centralized control of resources. The pharaohs held absolute power over land, labor, and taxes. The state-run economy allowed Egypt to thrive, dominating trade and controlling vast wealth. But even Egypt wasn't immune to the problems of over-centralization. As Egypt expanded, the empire struggled to maintain control. Corruption and a lack of innovation within the system stifled growth, and by the time external threats, like the Persians and later the Greeks came, Egypt was already weakened. What's the lesson here? Centralized economies are powerful, but without flexibility and innovation, they can become stagnant. When the system becomes rigid and fails to adapt, it becomes vulnerable to collapse. Next, we come to one of the most iconic empires in history, the Roman Empire. At its peak, Rome controlled vast territories from Britain to the Middle East and had one of the most sophisticated economies of its time. Trade, agriculture, and slavery fueled Rome's wealth. But as the empire expanded, so did the cost of maintaining it. The military became a significant burden, draining resources. Rome relied heavily on slave labor, which slowed technological progress, and it said that a lack of innovation became one of the key reasons for its downfall. Here is the big question. How did an empire that ruled for centuries crumble under its own weight? Rome's downfall was driven by overextension, too many territories, too many resources spent on military campaigns, and a tax burden on its citizens that left them weary and angry. The inflation caused by overproduction of currency and a reliance on external conquests led to financial instability. The lesson? Expansion without balance can lead to inevitable collapse. The cost of constant military campaigns, coupled with economic instability and social unrest, contributed to the fall of the mighty Roman Empire. After the fall of Rome, the Byzantine Empire rose in the east. For over 1,000 years, it survived when Rome crumbled, becoming a beacon of trade, culture, and military strength. The Byzantine economy was based on agricultural products, textiles, and state-run monopolies. It thrived as a major hub for trade between Europe, Asia, and Africa. But as powerful as it was, the Byzantine Empire could not escape the forces of internal division. The empire was constantly threatened by both external invaders and internal strife. By the 11th century, the economy was overburdened by military costs, and the division between the eastern and western parts of the empire only deepened. But here's where things get really interesting. The Byzantine economy was incredibly sophisticated, yet it was their failure to innovate that made their downfall so tragic. The empire's centralized economy became too dependent on traditional practices, leaving them unprepared for changing conditions in both trade and warfare. The lesson? Internal division and failure to evolve can cripple even the strongest economies. When an economy fails to adapt, it becomes vulnerable to both internal and external collapse. Jumping ahead to the age of exploration, we see the rise of European powers like Spain, Portugal, and later England and France. This was a golden age of colonial expansion and trade, driven by the discovery of new lands and the establishment of global trade routes. But what truly made these economies powerful? The influx of gold, silver, and spices from the Americas funded European empires and laid the foundation for global capitalism. The riches from the colonies sparked industrial growth in Europe, shifting the world's economic balance. However, the exploitation of colonies came at a high cost. European powers relied heavily on slavery and forced labor, which enriched the colonial powers but left deep social and economic scars on the colonies. The lesson here is harsh but undeniable. Economic prosperity built on exploitation creates long-term instability. While European economies flourished during this period, the systems they set up left a legacy of inequality that still affects the world today. As we've seen, the rise and fall of major economies throughout history often come down to a few key factors: sustainability, centralization, expansion, internal divisions, and the ability to innovate. The empires that thrived for centuries were ultimately undone by the very systems that helped them rise. We've seen how ancient civilizations, from Sumer to Rome, faced downfalls driven by overexpansion, corruption, and a failure to innovate. But as history marched forward, the modern world began to shape new forms of economic power. Let's look at some of the more recent examples of economic rise and collapse and the lessons they offer for today. As the world entered the 19th century, we saw the rise of industrial economies. Countries like Britain and Germany spearheaded the Industrial Revolution. The introduction of steam engines, factories, and mass production transformed economies and societies alike. The British Empire, in particular, reached its height during this period, dominating global trade through its extensive colonial empire. Britain's economy was built on industrialization and a vast network of colonies that provided raw materials. But just like the empires before it, the system that made Britain wealthy eventually sowed the seeds of its own undoing. The empire relied on imperialism and colonial extraction, and as the global market shifted and new powers like Germany and the United States began industrializing at an unprecedented rate, Britain found itself facing competition on all sides. The lesson here is that while industrialization can power an economy to new heights, it's the balance of power and resources, both internal and external, that ultimately keeps an empire thriving. Over-reliance on imperialism and outdated systems can lead to stagnation and decline. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we witnessed the rise of the United States as an economic superpower. The Industrial Revolution in the US saw massive growth, powered by natural resources, technological advancements, and a strong workforce. The American economy transformed into one of the most dynamic in the world. However, even this success was not without its pitfalls. The Great Depression of the 1930s exposed the flaws in an economy built on speculation, financial deregulation, and over-reliance on consumer debt. The collapse of stock markets in 1929 led to widespread unemployment, poverty, and social unrest. The American economy, despite being one of the largest and most prosperous in the world, was brought to its knees by its own overconfidence and lack of regulatory oversight. What was the lesson here? Unchecked growth and speculative markets can lead to devastating consequences. The US learned the hard way that an economy needs to be built on stability, foresight, and regulation. Without these factors, even the mightiest economies can falter. The 20th century saw the rise of Japan as an economic powerhouse, especially after World War II. The country, devastated by war, was rebuilt through a combination of industrial innovation and government intervention. Japan's post-war economic miracle was based on a disciplined workforce, technological innovation, and export-driven growth. However, by the late 1980s, Japan's economy showed signs of strain. The Japanese asset bubble, fueled by easy credit, real estate speculation, and an overinflated stock market, eventually burst in the early 1990s, triggering a long period of stagnation. Despite Japan's economic prowess, the failure to manage speculative excess and the lack of flexibility in adapting to global changes left the economy vulnerable. The lesson? Even an economic miracle can be undone by speculative excess. When markets are allowed to run unchecked, the consequences can be severe. No economy is immune to the forces of bubble economics, and without the ability to adapt and regulate, an economy can suffer for decades. As we look at more recent history, we can't ignore the collapse of the Soviet Union. The USSR, a powerful force in global politics and economy, collapsed in 1991, but its downfall was rooted in its economic model. The Soviet Union's centralized, state-controlled economy was initially successful in the early years, but it soon became inefficient and unable to meet the needs of a modern, globalized world. The Soviet government's rigid control over all aspects of the economy stifled innovation. While the world was transitioning to new technologies and more flexible market systems, the USSR was stuck in the past, unable to keep up. The lesson here is clear: centralized control without flexibility leads to stagnation. A lack of innovation and the failure to adapt to global economic changes can cause even the most powerful empires to crumble. Finally, let's consider the rise of China in the 21st century. Over the past few decades, China has transformed from a poor agrarian economy into one of the most powerful economic forces in the world. Through a mix of state capitalism, industrialization, and integration into the global economy, China has experienced explosive growth, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. However, China's rapid growth has come with its own set of challenges. The country is grappling with issues like environmental degradation, an aging population, and economic inequality. Its reliance on debt-driven growth and real estate speculation has created potential risks for future economic stability. The lesson: rapid growth comes with long-term challenges. While it's essential for economies to innovate and grow, those economies must also be mindful of sustainability, social equity, and environmental impact. Without a focus on these long-term goals, even the most powerful economies can face serious risks down the line.